Okay, so getting started here, the first thing you need to do is figure out where you're going to put your drops. Now, in my case, I've got a switch here, so it's a crossover. So I know I want to have feeders on all three sides of my switches. So typically that would be a dropper here. I'm going to put another one here, and then I've already actually drilled two on the far end. Now, I'm not worried about the section between the two switches, because if you follow the rails, this is solid, and it stays solid all the way through to the next switch. And vice versa is true as well. So let me bring you in here close, and we'll go ahead and we'll get started by drilling some holes. Before we get started, I want to point out the tools I'm using. I've got a soldering iron, solder, ruby flux, a paintbrush for the ruby flux, a pair of needle nose pliers, and a pair of wire strippers, and finally a sponge for cleaning off the tip of the soldering iron. Okay, so drilling holes here, I'm using a drill bit that is just slightly larger than the diameter of the wire, and I'm going to go ahead and drill a couple holes in between the rails. Now I've already drilled these, so they're coming out cleaner. But after you get the holes drilled, it's a good idea to go ahead and have a little vacuum on hand. To clean up all the sawdust that you might create. Now, when I wire a layout, I'm typically using white and black for my drops. Some people use red and black. And what I do is I use two differentiating colors primarily for one reason. So I can tell them apart underneath the layout. And because I'm using white and black, white always goes to the outside of the layout, like so, and then black goes on the inside. So it's white out. Now you could do black out either way, but white out tends to help me remember that the white one goes towards me. So next up, I'm going to get my wire strippers, and I'm going to strip back about an inch of wire. Go ahead and expose that. And then here's the trick of how I do things so cleanly. I actually take a pair of needle nose pliers here, and I'm actually going to bend a 90-degree angle on the end of my wire, and then I'm actually going to take that and I'm going to bend it over. So I'll include a photo so you can get a better view here, but you know, it creates kind of a little bit of a shepherd's hook. But the effect of that is when you pull the wire through and put it up against the track is in many cases it'll actually hold itself against the rail, so you don't have to hold it. So next up, I'm going to go ahead and grab my ruby fluid here, and today I'm doing something a little different. I'm going to use a little bristle brush to apply it. But the idea is basically the same as using an applicator or anything else. I'm just using the brush here because it happens to be what I have on hand. Now the only thing I will say about using a brush is if you do use it for your tinning flux, make sure you mark it so you don't try and use it for paint, because it will destroy your paint finishes. It is an acid after all. Alright, so next up I'm going to go ahead and pull out my solder here. Now, rather than dealing with the giant spool of wire, or of solder here, I'm just going to break off about a foot of it. And then I'm going to fold it in half again, and then spin it together. Now, normally I'm using a slightly thicker solder. This is 0.08 of a millimeter. I'm usually using 1 millimeter or 1.2 millimeter solder. so it's a little easier to work with. But I found that creating a little thicker piece here makes it a little easier for me to work on. So I'm going to grab my soldering iron here. So I'm just going to clean the tip of my soldering iron, put a little bit of solder on the tip, make sure my wire is lined up the way I want it, and then I'm just going to go ahead and give her a little bit of a tap. So you'll hear it sizzle a little bit, and then it will stick. And then we'll go ahead and do the other side too. So you'll notice there's a little bit of a shiny spot on top of the rail. That's okay. It actually is not a bump. You can feel it with your fingernail, but just barely. As soon as you stick a little bit of a bright boy on it, it disappears. Okay, so now that I've got my two joints soldered, I'm going to go ahead and use a, basically it's a bright boy, but in this case it's the PL41 rail cleaner from Pico. So essentially what it is it's just an eraser with a little bit of sanding abrasive embedded into the material. So I'm just going to go ahead over my solder joint, 4 or 5 passes, just enough to break the edge and take any solder that is on top off. I always feel with my finger to make sure it feels smooth. If it feels smooth to your finger and there's no hiccups on the inside of the rail, it's going to feel smooth to your trains and you're not going to have any issues. Okay, so now I'm underneath the layout and I've got my bus wires all run nice and neatly. I have them actually glued up with little peel and stick tabs in this particular area, but they're normally going through the holes in the benchwork. So in this particular case, I know I need to be attached to the yellow and white bus versus the purple and white that's going to a different power district. So what I'm going to do is I already took my wrap and I already pulled it out, so I've got distance to get my my wire strippers in there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take my power feeders and I'm going to do one color at a time. I'm going to strip about 1 inch of wire. Now as you continue on with your layout, you might notice that you need a little less or need a little bit more. So I encourage you to experiment with the length of the amount of wire you expose when you're doing this. You'll also notice that when you combine more wires, you will need more length to make sure you get wrapped around the bus. I do, however, try to limit it connections to 2 wires to the bus at any given time. Just for reliability's sake, it makes it a little cleaner, a little easier to install as well. So I've got my white wires exposed here. So now I'm going to go ahead and grab my strippers and go on the correct size gauge. And I am just going to grab and squeeze and expose a little piece of my bus there. Now I'm going to grab my 2 wires here, stick them along the side of my bus, and then I'm just going to wrap them around. Now I will try and tuck them as I wrap them so they wrap up nice and cleanly on my bus wire. So when I solder them, they'll be clean as well. Again, I'm going to take my 2 wires here, hold them side by side, and then I'll wrap them around the bus as soon as I get that stripped. And then they are ready for solder. So again, I'm going to be using flux. Now you can either use the Ruby flux here like I'm using today, or you can use Oatly number 95, which is a paste flux used for soldering copper pipes together. You can find it at Home Depot for about $3 a tin, I believe it is. And then we go ahead and we'll just solder those joints. What you'll notice in that break in the video is that I forgot my solder up on the tabletop. So words to the wise, make sure you have everything you need before you crawl under the layout so you don't have to get up and down, up and down. So I'm going to go ahead and just put a little bit of solder on my iron again, and then go ahead and touch the joint. The difference here is I will hold the soldering iron to it and then add more flux or more solder until it has enough for the joint. And it's simple as that. So another thing I'll encourage you to do is when you are soldering bus wires is to do them in groups. So you want to do somewhere between, say, 10 and 20 pairs at a time maximum. And the less you do at a time, the better. That way you can catch mistakes, because if for some reason you get the wires reversed, it's going to be a lot easier to debug 3 or 4 sets of bus wires or feeder wires than it would be to debug, 100 sets. Now, thankfully, on this giant layout that I'm working on, out of the probably 200 or 250 feeders that I've installed on this layout, I only had one that was reversed. And it was reversed on accident because of the way, it was a very complicated switching area. But no big deal. It took us about 10 minutes to find it because we did use that practice of do a little bit, test, and then do a little bit more and then test again. So it gave us the ability to make sure that we could find the issues as we had them. So now with the opposing color, now I'm doing the same process, but you'll notice that the stripped wire is about 1.5 inches to 2 inches apart. Now what this does is, as the layout's vibrating, moving around, it will make sure that these 2 points never contact each other. So, realistically, you never have to wrap these with electrical tape or anything like that. You can certainly, and if you are going to do electrical tape, I actually encourage you to find heat shrink tape. And what that is it's basically electrical tape, but what it does is when you heat it up is it actually glues itself together and turns into heat shrink and creates a nice positive joint. So again, I've got my whites about 1.5 inches to 2 inches away from my black feeders. So same process, strip them, wrap them around the bus, and then solder them in place. Wiring bus wires and feeders really isn't that difficult. You just have to take your time. I do recommend practicing a little bit. I'm using the soldering iron at full temperature, so I've got it set to number 5 on this doohickey. You don't have to use a soldering station like this. You can get just the soldering wand for about $12, at a number of different places. So realistically, you don't have to be fancy about it. The only thing I will tell you is keep your soldering tips clean. If you don't, they do tend to burn up, and then you have to replace them. And they're not terribly expensive, but when your soldering iron isn't working properly, it really makes the hobby less enjoyable. So that said, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Leave a comment down below. Remember that once I hit 15,000 subscribers, I will be giving a $5,000 value layout away to one of my viewers. So don't forget to comment, because that's how you're going to get entered into the competition. Also, for every 1,000 subscribers I hit, I will be giving away Amazon gift cards, some tools, and other little doodads and fun stuff along the way. So that said, I'll see you on the next video. Thanks for watching. Bye.